This content is generated or significantly edited using artificial intelligence tools. All information is provided for general informational purposes only and reflects knowledge available at the time of publication. It does not constitute financial, investment, or legal advice. We recommend that listeners verify the information independently and consult with qualified professionals for personalized advice. Welcome to the Luxembourg Fundcast.
All right, let's cut straight to it. Today we're diving deep into something absolutely critical for anyone working with investment funds or securitization in Luxembourg. The offering documents, we're talking prospectuses, offering memoranda, issuing documents, all that, dense, complex paperwork that underpins these structures. We've pulled insights from a stack of sources you've provided covering the EU regulations, the specific Luxembourg laws, what needs to go in them, and some really crucial recent updates. Our mission in this deep dive is basically to unpack all of that for you, make sense of the jargon, understand why these documents are so vital for investor protection and market access,
and also see how the requirements shift depending on whether it's, say, a retail fund, a sophisticated investor AIF, or a securitization deal. Think of this as your essential roadmap to understanding the legal blueprints of Luxembourg's financial products. We'll try to cover the key who, what, where, when, why, and how. To guide us through this paperwork forest, I'm joined by our expert.
Thanks for having me. It's a topic that might sound a bit dry maybe, but honestly, understanding these documents is absolutely foundational. They're really the bedrock of transparency and, frankly, trust in the market here.
Absolutely. Foundational is the right word. So let's lay that foundation then. When we talk about the rules governing these documents in Luxembourg, where do we even start? It feels complex.
Okay, yeah, let's unpack this. It really is a layered system. You've got the European Union level setting the stage, and then Luxembourg national law implementing or sometimes adding specifics on top of that. So at the EU level, the big one for public offers of securities is the prospectus regulation. That's EU 2017-1129.
Right.
The core idea there, and the regulation itself makes this clear, is about harmonization across the EU.
Okay.
It's aiming for better investor protection, but also making it easier to raise capital across borders. It dictates the content, the approval process, the distribution for securities offered publicly or listed on a regulated market. And importantly, this is directly applicable EU law. Everyone has to follow it.
And we know that regulation has been tweaked recently, haven't we, with the Listing Act?
Precisely. Yeah, the recent EU Listing Act package, it brought in changes specifically aimed at making EU public markets, more attractive, particularly trying to help smaller and medium-sized enterprises, SMEs. So this adjusted some thresholds and created lighter prospectus formats, which directly impacts the documentation requirements we're talking about.
Okay, that's prospectuses. What about securitization?
Right. For securitization, there's the EU Securitization Regulation, EU 2001-2402. This provides a general framework, and the big emphasis here is on transparency. It requires the parties involved, so the originators, sponsors, and the securitization vehicle itself, the SSPE, to make pretty detailed information available to investors. And interestingly, even if a full prospectus isn't required under the prospectus regulation, this securitization regulation still mandates a transaction summary. So transparency is key.
Okay, so those are the big EU picture rules. How does Luxembourg law specifically build on that?
Good question. Luxembourg implements these and adds its own national specifics. You have the Luxembourg Prospectus Law of 16 July 2019. This specifically operationalizes the EU prospectus regulation within Luxembourg. Crucially, it designates the CSSF, our financial regulator, as the competent authority for approving prospectuses here. This law also used to set specific national thresholds for offers that didn't need a full EU prospectus, though, like we said, the EU Listing Act is changing some of that landscape now.
Makes sense. And for securitization specifically?
For securitization, the core domestic law is the Luxembourg Securitization Law, dating back to 22 March 2004, though it's been amended. This is the framework for those SVs, the securitization vehicles, which can be companies or funds. A really significant amendment came through with the law of 25 February 2022. This update brought some much-needed clarity on several points.
Oh, like what?
Well, for instance, it clarified that active management of debt portfolios is actually possible under certain conditions within the securitization framework. It also explicitly included loans as financing instruments that SVs can issue securities against. And perhaps most critically, it refined the definition of an offer to the public. This is really important because that definition determines when an SV falls under CSSF supervision and potentially needs a full public offer prospectus.
That 2022 amendment sounds like it was a really practical, necessary clarification for people actually doing these deals.
It absolutely was, yeah. By clarifying those public offer triggers things like the denomination threshold. Who it's offered to, it gave a lot more certainty on when that higher level of CSSF supervision kicks in and when you need that full prospectus.
Okay. And who are the main referees here? The key regulatory bodies overseeing all this detailed paperwork?
Domestically, it's absolutely the CSSF, the Commission of Surveillance of the Secteur Financier. They are central. They approve public offer prospectuses. They supervise certain SVs. They authorize and oversee investment fund managers and the regulated funds themselves. And importantly, their practical guidance, which often comes through circulars and FAQs, is really essential for navigating the day-to-day application of the rules. You need to watch those.
Right. The CSSF circulars are key. And at the EU level?
At the EU level, you have ESMA, the European Securities and Markets Authority. They play a really vital role. ESMA develops the technical standards, the guidelines, the Q&As, basically ensuring that EU law is applied consistently across all the member states. So their work directly informs the sort of nitty-gritty details that end up having to be in these offering documents.
So if I'm, say, putting together one of these documents or maybe reviewing one for compliance, what does this whole layered system actually mean in practice? Does it just make things more complicated?
It means you definitely can't just look at one piece of law in isolation. You have to consider the EU regulations setting the big principles, then the Luxembourg law that implements or adds to it, and then you have to overlay the practical guidance from both ESMA at the EU level and the CSSF here in Luxembourg, detailing how to actually apply those rules. It really requires understanding the interplay between these different levels. It's complex, yes, but it's manageable with the right expertise.
Okay, that lays a really solid foundation. Let's maybe jump into the fund world specifically now. I imagine, different types of funds must mean very different paperwork requirements, right?
Precisely. Yeah, the required documentation depends very heavily on the fund's regulatory category and, crucially, who the fund is actually being marketed to. The target investor is key.
Okay, let's start with the one most people might have heard of, UCITS. These are generally for retail investors, is that right?
That's exactly right. UCITS undertakings for collective investment in transferable securities, they're designed specifically for retail investors across the EU. They operate under a highly harmonized regime governed by the UCI law here in Luxembourg. And because they target retail investors, the documentation is really designed for maximum clarity and, importantly, comparability. The key documents for UCITS are the full UCITS prospectus and the key information document, or KID. Now, historically, there was something called the KID, but for UCITS offered to retail investors now, the PRIPS regulation generally mandates the use of the PRIPS KID.
Okay, prospectus and KID. Why are these two documents so fundamental for UCITS? What's their core purpose?
Well, think of it this way. The prospectus provides the comprehensive details, sort of the whole story of the fund. The KID, on the other hand, is designed intentionally to be a short, very standardized summary, easy to grasp quickly. Their combined purpose, and this is reflected clearly in the UCI law, is really to ensure retail investors get clear, comprehensive, and crucially comparable information. The idea is to allow them to make genuinely informed decisions and properly understand the risks involved before they put their money in.
Makes sense. And who's actually on the hook for the content? Who's responsible for making sure these documents are accurate?
Responsibility ultimately lies with the UCITS itself, especially if it's structured as a self-managed investment company, which is less common. More typically, it's the appointed management company, the ManCo. But really, the governing body, so the board of directors of the fund or the board of the management company, bears the ultimate responsibility for ensuring the prospectus and KID are accurate, complete, and kept up to date.
Okay. And what kind of detail does the law actually require in a UCITS prospectus? Is it very prescriptive?
Oh, yes. The UCI law, particularly its Annex I, Schedule A, is quite prescriptive. It mandates specific sections covering things like the fund's investment objectives and policies. That means detailing what assets it can hold, how it uses derivatives, and increasingly how ESG factors are integrated if that's relevant. It also requires a comprehensive risk profile. And importantly, this must be tailored to the fund's specific risks, not just, generic market warnings copied and pasted.
Ah, so no boilerplate risk factors allowed.
Exactly. Regulators really frown on that. Then, crucially, there's a significant focus on fees, charges, and expenses. Disclosure must be absolutely clear, covering all costs borne by the fund or the investors, including things like the total expense ratio, the TER. Other mandatory sections cover operational details like how to subscribe and redeem shares, the valuation rules, historical performance figures, always with a warning that past performance isn't future performance, general taxation information, and what happens if the fund liquidates or merges.
Got it. Very detailed. And the KID, you said it's shorter. What's packed into that?
Yeah, the PREEPS KID is even more strictly defined by the PREEPS regulation itself. It's very structured. It has specific sections covering the product's nature, the risks and potential returns, often using a standardized summary risk indicator, like a number from 1 to 7. It also details the costs, presented in a really clear, comparable format using standardized tables. And it mentions the recommended holding period. The whole point is that it's usually just a few pages long, specifically designed to help investors quickly compare different investment products side by side.
Okay. And where do these documents get their formal stamp of approval, so to speak? Who signs off?
Both the UCITS prospectus and the KID must be submitted to the CSSF. Traditionally, they received a physical visa stamp, literally a stamp on the document.
Right, I remember seeing those.
Exactly. But a significant change is actually coming very soon. Effective April 2025, the CSSF is rolling out a new e-identification procedure. This will be done via their online portal, eDesk for UCITS and certain other types of funds. This EID effectively replaces the physical visa stamp with a unique electronic identifier. The key point is the documents must be identified or approved before they can be published and used to offer shares to investors.
So this new e-identification process, does that change how documents get updated later on if something changes in the fund?
Yes, it definitely streamlines things. That's the idea. Prospectuses have to be updated for any material changes, and often annually anyway, to incorporate the latest financial statements. The new e-identification procedure clarifies that certain, let's say, routine amendments don't actually require prior CSSF review anymore. They won't need a brand new e-identification number each time.
Okay.
However, the governing body, the fund board, or the ManCo board, remains fully responsible for the accuracy of those changes. The CSSF can still do ex post reviews, check them after the fact. Amendments that do still require prior regulatory review, the more significant ones, will still go through the standard CSSF assessment process first before they get their e-identification. So it shifts some administrative burden, but arguably increases the direct accountability on the fund's management for certain updates.
Got it. So very high scrutiny, detailed rules for retail funds like UCITS. What about the other side of the coin, alternative investment funds, or AIFs? These are generally aimed at more sophisticated investors, right?
Exactly. AIFs, which are governed by the AIFM law, that's Luxembourg's implementation of the EU's Alternative Investment Fund Managers Directive, or AIFMD, are typically marketed to professional investors, or what are called well-informed investors. Because this audience is presumed to be more sophisticated, more able to assess risks themselves, the regulatory focus shifts slightly. It's heavily focused on the authorized AIFM, the manager, and their obligations, which importantly include disclosure requirements. The primary documents here are usually called an offering memorandum, OM, or sometimes a private placement memorandum, PPM. These contain the mandatory pre-investment disclosures required by AIFMD. However, and this is a really key distinction, if an AIF is offered to the public, or if it's listed on a regulated market, then it must prepare a full prospectus regulation compliant prospectus. And that document is subject to CSSF approval, just like a UCS prospectus.
Okay. So the audience and the offering method still dictate the type of document and the level of regulatory approval needed, even for AIFs.
Absolutely. For purely private placements to sophisticated investors under the AIFMD framework, the OM or PPM is generally considered sufficient. It doesn't need CSSF pre-approval itself, but it must provide enough information for these sophisticated investors to make their own informed decisions about the investment, understand the risks properly, and also assess the capabilities and integrity of the AIFM managing the fund. Transparency regarding the AIFM's operations and the fund strategy is really paramount under AIFMD.
And who holds the pen, so to speak? Who is ultimately responsible for these AIF documents, the OM or PPM?
The authorized AIFM. They are responsible for ensuring that all the required pre-investment disclosures are made accurately and completely in the OM or PPM. That's a core obligation under the AIFM law.
And what kind of information are we talking about in those AIFMD disclosures? What must be included?
Article 23 of AIFMD, which is transposed directly into the Luxembourg AIFM law, sets out the mandatory requirements quite clearly. It's pretty extensive. It includes things like a detailed description of the investment strategy and objectives, how leverage is used, collateral and asset reuse policies, and the procedure if the strategy needs to change. It also requires identification of all the key service providers, the AIFM itself, the depositary, the auditor, and details of any functions the AIFM has delegated to others. The valuation procedure is another key one, especially for funds holding illiquid assets that's been a focus of recent CSSF guidance. Liquidity risk management processes, including redemption rights and any gates or lockups, must be disclosed. How investors are treated fairly, including any preferential treatment given to certain investors, needs to be laid out. And of course, full details of all the fees, charges, and expenses borne by investors, plus the AIFM's conflicts of interest policy and how they manage conflicts.
Okay, quite comprehensive still, even if not for retail. Now, is that AIFM offering memorandum pre-approved by the CSSF in the same way a UCITS prospectus is?
Generally, no. For those AIFMD-only disclosures contained within an OM or PPM used for private placement, the document itself is not subject to CSSF pre-approval. Instead, the CSSF supervises the AIFM as a regulated entity, ensuring they comply with all their overall obligations, which includes making these required disclosures correctly. But, as I mentioned earlier, if a public offer is made, triggering the need for a full prospectus regulation prospectus, then that document does need CSSF pre-approval. And also, AIFMs need to follow specific marketing notification procedures with the CSSF before they can actually market AIF units in Luxembourg or passport them for marketing cross-border within the EU. That's a separate process from document approval.
Right. And what about pre-marketing? You hear that term a lot. How does that factor into the documentation side of things?
Yes, pre-marketing. That's now governed by harmonized EU rules under the Cross-Border Distribution of Funds Directive, the CBDF. Luxembourg implemented this via the law of 21 July 2021. Basically, if an AIFM uses draft documents, like an early version of the OM, during preliminary discussions with potential professional investors before a formal offer is made, those documents must carry very clear disclaimers. They have to state explicitly that the information is incomplete, it might change, and crucially, that it does not constitute an offer or an invitation to subscribe. Pre-marketing activity also requires a separate notification to the competent authority, the CSSF in this case. And there's an important rule to be aware of. Any subscription made by an investor who is contacted during pre-marketing, if it happens within 18 months of that contact, is legally considered to be the result of marketing. This significantly impacts the AIFM's ability to later claim that the subscription came purely from reverse solicitation, meaning the investor approached them unsolicited. So even early-stage documents and discussions need careful handling.
Okay, that 18-month rule is definitely something to keep in mind. That's clear on AIFs for sophisticated investors. What about RAIFs then, the reserved alternative investment funds? Where do they fit into this documentation picture? They seem like a special Luxembourg category.
They are indeed a specific Luxembourg regime established by the RAIF law. RAIFs are a type of alternative investment fund, but a key feature is that the RAIF vehicle itself is not subject to direct CSS product authorization or ongoing supervision. The condition for this lighter regime is that the RAIFs must be managed by a fully authorized external AIFM. The oversight focuses on the manager, not the product directly. The principal document for our RAIF is called the document d'émission, which translates basically to the issuing document.
Okay, the document d'émission. And what's the purpose of that specific document?
The RAIF law requires it to provide well-informed investors, and that's a legally defined category, including institutional investors, professional investors, or other investors who meet certain minimum investment thresholds and confirm in writing they understand the risks with the information necessary for them to properly judge the investment and its associated risks.
Is the content of this document d'émission as strictly defined as, say, a UCITS prospectus? Is there a checklist?
Not in the same way, no. The RFI itself doesn't provide an exhaustive checklist of required content like the UCI law does for UCITS. However, it must contain sufficient information for these well-informed investors to make an informed judgment. So in practice, you'll find it covers very similar ground to a typical AIF offering memorandum. The investment strategy, the risks involved, the terms and conditions, fees, service providers, and so on, it needs to be comprehensive enough for that sophisticated audience. There's also a crucial point in the RAIF law, Article 45.3, I believe, which states that if RAIF does publish a full prospectus regulation compliant prospectus, maybe because it is offered publicly or gets listed, then the obligation to have a separate document d'émission is actually waived. The prospectus covers it.
Right, makes sense. And the big question then, is the RAIF document d'émission approved by the CSSF before use?
No. And this is a core feature, a key difference of the RAIF regime. There is no CSSF product pre-approval required for the RAIF's document emission itself. The regulatory oversight model relies entirely on the fact that the RAIF must be managed by an already supervised external AIFM. The assumption is the supervised AIFM will ensure the document is compliant. So the document emission is provided directly by the RAIF or its AIF to the prospective well-informed investors without prior CSSF sign-off on the document itself.
Okay, so just to sum up the fund side then, it really boils down to who you're selling to the target investor and which specific legal framework applies. That dictates the level of detail, the type of document, and crucially, whether you need that CSSF pre-approval or not.
Exactly. That's a perfect summary. You have this tiered approach. The most extensive regulation and direct CSSF product approval is reserved for retail investors via UCITS. Then, for sophisticated investors targeted by AIFs under AIFMD or RAIFs, the regulatory focus shifts more towards the AIFM's conduct and ensuring proper disclosures are made. The offering document itself might not always require prior CSSF approval unless a public offer trigger is hit. But underlying all of these different regimes, the fundamental purpose remains the same: to provide the investor, whether retail or professional, with sufficient, accurate information to make an informed decision and properly understand the risks they are taking on.
That provides excellent clarity on the different fund documentation pathways. Let's pivot now, if we can, to securitization. How does the paperwork function for these deals, where assets are pooled together and then securities are issued based on them?
All right, securitization in Luxembourg typically uses securitization vehicles, or SVs. These can be set up as companies or specific types of funds under the Luxembourg securitization law we mentioned earlier. The documentation here is really shaped by a combination of factors: the Luxembourg securitization law itself, the EU securitization regulation with its transparency focus, and potentially the EU prospectus regulation if the securities being issued are offered publicly or listed on a regulated market. So the actual documents involved can range quite a bit. It might just be the SV's constitutional documents plus a deal-specific offering memorandum for a private deal, or it could be a full-blown prospectus regulation compliant prospectus for a public offering.
And why are these documents so particularly critical in a securitization context? What's their main job?
They were absolutely essential for informing investors about what's really going on under the hood.
Yeah.
They need to explain the underlying assets that are backing the securities, the often quite complex transaction structure, like how cash flows get distributed through the waterfall to different tranches of securities. They also need to detail the specific risks associated with that particular deal and those assets, and of course, the terms of the securities the investors are actually buying. Fundamentally, they are vital for meeting those broad transparency obligations under the EU securitization regulation, and if it's a public deal, the investor protection standards set by the prospectus regulation.
Okay. And who generally carries the responsibility for the accuracy and completeness of all that information in these securitization documents?
Typically, it's a shared responsibility, often falling on the originator of the assets being securitized, the sponsor of the deal if there is one, and their special purpose entity itself, the SSPE, which is the Luxembourg SV in our context. The EU securitization regulation places specific transparency duties squarely on these parties.
Makes sense. What kind of information do these documents actually need to contain then? What are the core content requirements?
Again, it partly depends on whether it's a public or a private deal, but the EU securitization regulation, specifically Article 7, imposes significant transparency requirements, regardless of whether a full prospectus is needed. It mandates that detailed information must be made available, often through regulated securitization repositories that are registered with ESMA, or sometimes via a dedicated website for the deal. This includes things like granular data on the underlying exposures, the loans or receivables in the pool. It requires providing access to essential underlying documentation, like the sale agreements for the assets or the servicing contracts. Like we mentioned, it requires a summary of the transaction details if no full prospectus is produced. And critically, it mandates regular detailed investor reports covering the performance of the underlying assets, whether any performance triggers have been hit, and exactly how cash flows are moving through the structure.
Okay, that's the securitization regulation baseline. What if it is a public offer or listing?
Right, if it's a public offer or listing, then the prospectus regulation kicks in fully. That requires a formal CSSF-approved prospectus. This prospectus has to follow specific content annexes within the prospectus regulation that are designed for debt or asset-backed securities. It would need to include a detailed description of the securitized asset pool, the full transaction structure, including any credit enhancement mechanisms, tailored risk factors specific to those assets in that structure. It also needs information on all the parties involved, the servicer, the paying agent, calculation agent, etc. Details on how the servicing of the assets works, the precise cash flow mechanics or waterfall, and of course the full terms and conditions of the securities being issued. And don't forget, the Luxembourg Securitization law itself contributes here by defining the SV structure and, importantly, through that 2022 amendment, clarifying exactly what constitutes an offer to the public that triggers CSSF supervision and the potential need for this full prospectus.
Right, that 2022 amendment clarity seems really key here too.
Absolutely. It clarified that an issuance is considered a public offer unless it meets certain cumulative conditions. It has to be exclusively to professional clients and have a denomination of at least $100,000 for security and qualify as a private placement. If it fails any of those tests, it's potentially a public offer triggering CSSF supervision of the SV itself regarding those public issuances and likely needing a prospectus.
Okay, so where did these securitization documents actually get approved or published then? Is it always the CSSF?
Not necessarily. For private placements or other non-public offers, the offering document itself is generally not subject to CSSF pre-approval. Although, as that 2022 law clarified, SVs that issue securities continuously to the public are now explicitly supervised by the CSSF for those activities. But for a one-off public offer, yes, that requires the formal CSSF-approved prospectus. The transparency information required under the EU securitization regulation, however, that's typically published electronically, usually via those registered repositories or dedicated deal websites, not directly through the CSSF necessarily.
So the process itself must be quite different depending on whether it's a public or private deal.
Absolutely. The public offer pathway involves that formal cycle: drafting the prospectus, submitting it to the CSSF, going through their review and comment process, getting formal approval, and then publishing it according to the rules. Very similar to a public fund prospectus. The private placement route, on the other hand, is much more driven by direct contractual agreements between the issuer and the investors and fulfilling those direct transparency duties under the EU securitization regulation, like providing the ongoing investor reports. That 2022 law's clarification on the public offer definition really sharpened the line between these two paths.
Understood. One more thing on securitization. What about structures where you have different pools of assets kept separate within one single SV? How is that handled in the documents?
Ah, yes, compartmentalization. That's a key feature allowed by the Luxembourg securitization law. And the 2022 amendments actually added further clarity there, too. Offering documents for compartmentalized SVs must very clearly describe each separate compartment or distinct pool of assets held within that single legal entity. Critically, they must also detail how the recourse of the investors holding securities linked to one compartment is legally segregated and limited only to the assets and cash flows belonging to their specific compartment. The assets of other compartments are protected. The 2022 law also clarified how different compartments can potentially have specific decision-making rights allocated to them, perhaps linked to the securities they've issued. If that's the case, those specific governance rights would also need to be clearly documented in the offering materials.
Okay, that distinction between public and private offers, the impact of the 2022 law, and the compartmentalization rules, that's really helpful for understanding the securitization side. Let's maybe shift gears now and talk about the practicalities across the board. Let's get into the nitty-gritty, the process, the content, costs, timelines, the 5 Ws, and how did these documents actually go from just an idea to a final published document?
Sure, it's definitely a structured process. And while the specifics obviously vary depending on whether it's a UCITS and AIF or a securitization, there are common threads, especially when CSS approval is part of the equation.
Okay, so let's start with the why. We touched on it, but why are these documents fundamentally necessary?
Well, first and foremost, it's a fundamental legal obligation. Laws like the prospectus regulation, the UCI law for UCITS, the AIFM law, the securitization law, they all mandate detailed disclosure. The primary drivers are investor protection and maintaining market integrity. But beyond just the legal duty, they are absolutely essential market tools. You simply cannot effectively offer or market these complex financial products without providing comprehensive, clear information to potential investors. It's how you explain what you're selling.
Right. And whose is involved in actually creating them? It sounds like a team effort.
It absolutely is. The primary responsibility always lies with the issuer. So the fund itself, the offerer, the fund's governing body, the board, or the AIFM or SV management team. They are ultimately accountable for the content, but they work very closely, hand in hand usually, with legal advisors. Lawyers are crucial for drafting the text and ensuring it complies with all the complex rules and regulations. Auditors play a role too, providing comfort on any financial figures included. The CSSF, as we've discussed, is the key regulatory approver for public offers and regulated funds. And if the securities are going to be listed on an exchange, the Luxembourg Stock Exchange adds its own layer of listing rules that need to be incorporated or at least referenced in the prospectus.
Okay, quite a few players. What about the how? What are the key steps involved in creating and getting these documents approved?
It typically starts with drafting, usually led by the issuer or the manager, working closely with their legal counsel. This draft then goes through various stages of internal review and refinement. If regulatory approval is needed, like for a UCITS prospectus or a public offer prospectus under the prospectus regulation, the draft is then formally submitted to the CSSF. For funds, as we mentioned, this is increasingly happening via the CSSF's eDesk platform, especially with the new e-identification system coming. The CSSF then reviews the submission. They might ask questions, issue comments, pointing out areas needing clarification or changes. The document gets revised based on that feedback, possibly resubmitted. Once the CSSF is satisfied that the document meets all the requirements, they grant their approval, which used to be the visa stamp and will increasingly be the e-identification. Then the final approved document must be published according to the specific rules, often electronically on websites, sometimes still requiring physical copies depending on the context. And importantly, if any significant material changes happen after publication, a supplement detailing those changes must usually be drafted, submitted to the CSSF for approval, often on a slightly faster track, and then published promptly.
Right. The supplement process is key for keeping things current. And where does this process physically or legally take place? Is it all Luxembourg-centric?
Primarily, yes. It happens in Luxembourg because we're dealing with Luxembourg-domiciled entities, the funds, the SVs, the managers, the drafting, the legal advice, the CSSF interaction, it's all centered here. However, a key benefit of the EU framework is passporting. Once a document is approved under relevant EU rules, like the prospectus regulation for public offers, or once an AIFM is authorized under AIFMD, the fund or securities can often be passported for offering or marketing in other EU member states without needing separate local approvals in each country. This really facilitates cross-border distribution.
Okay, got it. Let's maybe circle back to the content side for a moment, the what. Beyond the specifics we've already discussed for different product types, are there some universally critical sections that appear in most offering documents, especially those subject to public offer rules, that really need careful attention?
Absolutely. Certain sections are pretty much always mandatory across different document types and require particular care in drafting. Risk factors. These are absolutely crucial, and regulators scrutinize them closely. Regulations like the prospectus regulation explicitly demand they are specific and material to the issuer or the specific securities being offered. ESMA guidance strongly discourages using generic boilerplate risks that could apply to anything.
So market volatility isn't enough on its own.
Definitely not. You need to explain how market volatility specifically impacts this fund or this deal. Interestingly, the recent EU Listing Act actually removed the strict requirement to rank risks numerically by materiality, but they still must be presented consistently with how the issuer assesses them internally. The bottom line is they need to be tailored, specific, and genuinely reflect the key risks: fees, charges, and expenses. Transparency here is non-negotiable. Comprehensive, clear disclosure of all costs that will be borne by the investor or deducted from the vehicle is mandatory under multiple laws. Regulators want investors to see exactly what they're paying for. Conflicts of interest. Particularly under UCITS and AIFMD regulations, there's a specific requirement to disclose potential conflicts of interest situations where the manager's interests might not align with the investors, and crucially, to describe the procedures the firm has put in place to manage or mitigate those conflicts fairly. Prospectus summary. For documents falling under the prospectus regulations, so public offers, a concise summary is mandatory. This is especially important for retail investors. The EU Listing Act made some changes here too. For example, explicitly allowing the use of charts to improve clarity and slightly extending the possible length in very complex cases, like those involving multiple guarantors. The aim is always to make it genuinely useful and easy to understand while still being concise.
Are aspects of these documents, maybe the commercial terms within them, ever subject to negotiation between the parties involved?
That's a good point. While the mandatory disclosure content itself is dictated strictly by law and regulation, you can't negotiate not to include a required section. Certain underlying commercial terms that need to be disclosed within the document are definitely negotiated between the parties. This could include things like the precise level of the management fee or performance fee in a fund agreement, specific risk allocation clauses agreed upon in the underlying contracts for a securitization deal, or the exact terms of the securities being issued, like the coupon rate, maturity date, or specific covenants. These negotiated commercial terms must then be accurately and transparently reflected and disclosed within the offering document, all operating within the framework and boundaries set by the regulations.
Okay. What about the costs involved in this whole process? Getting these documents drafted, reviewed, approved, it sounds expensive.
It certainly involves various costs. There are direct regulatory fees payable to the CSSF for the review and approval processes. Legal fees for the extensive drafting, reviewing, and advising are often significant, as it's specialized work. You'll also have auditor fees, particularly for verifying financial information. If the securities are being listed on an exchange like the Lux SE, there are listing fees. Historically, there were printing and physical distribution costs, though that's increasingly shifting towards digital, which might change the cost structure somewhat. For securitization deals, rating agency fees can be substantial if the securities are being rated. And then you have ongoing fees for various service providers involved with the fund or vehicle. Plus, if you're distributing cross-border, translation costs for the documents can really add up.
And who typically picks up the tab for all these costs?
Generally, it's the issuer of the fund or the securitization vehicle itself that bears these costs, which means ultimately, for funds at least, these costs are borne indirectly by the investors through the fund's expenses. This is precisely why regulations like PRIPes and UCITS put such a strong emphasis on the mandatory, transparent disclosure of all costs and charges. Investors need to know what expenses are coming out of their investment.
Right. And finally, on the practicalities timelines, the when. How long does this whole process actually take from start to finish?
Timelines. They are absolutely crucial for issuers trying to hit specific market windows, but predicting them precisely can be tricky as they vary significantly. For prospectuses under the prospectus regulation, the CSSF has a statutory review period. It's set at a maximum of 10 working days for their first review of an initial complete submission. However, this clock can stop if they need more information or clarification, so the actual time can be longer.
Okay, 10 days maximum for the first let, potentially longer. What about supplements?
Supplements for material changes are generally reviewed faster. The typical turnaround is often quoted as 5 to 7 working days, and the EU Listing Act changes might even reduce this further in some cases, possibly down to 3 to 5 days. Fund authorization timelines, separate from just prospectus approval, can vary even more widely. They depend heavily on the complexity of the fund structure and, very importantly, on the quality and completeness of the application file submitted by the applicant. CSSF statistics often show that a significant portion of the overall authorization time is actually spent with the applicant responding to CSSF queries or providing missing information.
So getting the initial submission right is key to efficiency.
Absolutely. Preparation and submitting a high-quality, complete file from the very start is the best way to manage the timeline. For AIFM marketing notifications, the CSSF has a statutory period of 20 working days to inform the AIFM whether their notification file is complete and they can start marketing. Publication deadlines also exist. For instance, the EU Listing Act reduced the minimum time a prospectus needs to be available before the end of an IPO, down to 3 working days in some cases. So, yes, managing the timing across drafting, review, approval, and publication is a critical part of the whole process.
Okay, that covers the practicalities really well. It definitely sounds like staying on top of this documentation isn't a static, one-and-done process. It seems to require constant attention to changes, right?
Oh, absolutely. These documents are definitely dynamic, living things in a way. They have to be, because the products they describe can change, the market conditions change, and perhaps most importantly, the regulatory landscape itself is constantly evolving.
So what kind of things typically trigger updates or require changes to these documents once they're published?
Several things. Any material change that could reasonably affect an investor's assessment of the securities, that's the standard under Prospectus Regulation, Article 23, requires a formal supplement to be issued promptly. For funds specifically, this could include significant changes to the investment policy or strategy, changes to the fee structures, appointing new key service providers like the depository or auditor, or launching new sub-funds within an existing umbrella structure. All those would typically require a prospectus update. Regulatory updates are another major trigger. When new rules come in, like the enhanced ESG disclosure requirements driven by SFDR or the changes brought by the EU Listing Act, the existing documents often need to be amended to reflect those new legal requirements. And many funds also have a practice, sometimes required by regulation, of updating their full prospectus at least annually, usually to incorporate their latest audited financial statements.
You've mentioned several recent regulatory changes that are impacting documentation throughout our chat. Could you maybe highlight the biggest ones that people really need to be watching right now?
Sure. I think there are a few key ones with significant documentation impact. The EU Listing Act is a big one. It's directly changing prospectus regulation prospectuses, affecting the required content, the format, potentially introducing page limits for some of the new lighter prospectus types, changing how risk factors are presented, enhancing the summary section, and also strongly pushing for electronic delivery as the default. Then there's the new CSSF e-identification procedure we talked about, coming in April 2025 for UCITS, Part 2 UCIs, SICRs, and SIFs. This is a major administrative shift away from the physical visa stamp. While it aims to streamline updates for certain types of amendments, it clearly places greater direct responsibility on the fund's governing body for the accuracy and compliance of changes that don't require prior CSSF review.
Right, that shift in responsibility seems important.
It is. Then, the Luxembourg Securitization Law Amendments of 2022. These brought really vital clarity on that public offer definition, which directly impacts when a full prospectus might be needed for an SV. They also formally confirmed the inclusion of loans as eligible financing instruments and refined the rules around active management for SVs. All practical points needing reflection in deal documents. And finally, the CBDF directive, implemented back in 2021. This harmonized the rules for pre-marketing by AIFMs across the EU. This directly affects how even draft offering documents are used in those early conversations with potential investors, requiring clear disclaimers, consistency with eventual marketing materials, and those marketing notification procedures.
Looking beyond those specific changes, what are the overarching trends you see shaping these documentation requirements going forward? What's the bigger picture?
I think several major trends are quite clear and likely to continue. First, ESG integration. Environmental, social, and governance factors are becoming increasingly embedded and mandatory in disclosures, driven by regulations like SFDR, and now being incorporated into the prospectus regulation via the EU Listing Act. This is no longer optional for many. Second, digitalization. We see this with the CSSF's move to e-identification in online portals and ESMA's push towards more digital submission and use of regulatory data. This requires market participants to adapt their own systems and processes towards more digital workflows. Third, there's a clear policy effort, visible in the EU Listing Act, to facilitate SME access to public capital markets, partly through creating lighter, potentially less burdensome prospectus formats for smaller issuers. Fourth, as hinted with the e-identification changes, there's a trend towards placing increased direct responsibility on the governing bodies, the boards of the regulated entities themselves. As regulators perhaps streamline certain upfront approval processes, the onus increases on the firms to ensure ongoing compliance, possibly backed by more ex post supervision. And finally, underpinning all of this is the need for continuous vigilance. Staying compliant means constantly monitoring new CSSS circulars, like the recent one clarifying NAV error reporting, which impacts fund operations and potentially disclosures, and keeping up with the stream of guidelines and Q&As from ESMA, which provide crucial detail on how EU laws should be applied consistently in practice.
So it sounds like staying compliant and keeping these crucial documents current and accurate is absolutely a continuous, demanding job in this environment.
Precisely. You said it perfectly. The framework is both incredibly detailed and very dynamic. It demands deep technical expertise, careful attention to detail, and ongoing diligence from everyone involved, the issuers, the managers, the advisors. As some of the materials related to those securitization law amendments highlighted, understanding and correctly applying these detailed legal provisions requires constant, careful attention. It's not a set-and-forget task.
Before we wrap things up, let's just touch briefly on one more area of tax. Is that something that needs to be detailed extensively in these offering documents as well?
Yes, tax information is typically included, but usually with very important limitations and caveats. The typical tax disclosures you'll find will provide a general overview of the tax regime that applies to the fund or the vehicle itself in Luxembourg. So for instance, it might cover the annual subscription tax, taxe d'abonnement, that applies to UCITS and AIFs, or perhaps the conditions for tax neutrality that qualifying securitization vehicles can benefit from, as laid out in laws like the RAIF law or the securitization law.
However, and this is an absolutely crucial disclaimer that you will always see prominently displayed, these tax sections are not intended as tax advice for the individual investor reading the document.
Ah, right, the big warning label.
Exactly. They contain very strong, prominent warnings urging investors explicitly to consult their own independent tax advisors, based in their own jurisdiction of residence, to understand the specific tax consequences for them. The section might also briefly mention things like potential Luxembourg withholding tax on distributions, which is often zero for non-resident investors, depending on the fund structure and double tax treaties, and maybe reference the impact of international tax reporting standards like FECA or CRS, which require financial institutions to report information about account holders to tax authorities.
Why is the scope of the tax information provided usually so limited then? Why not give more detail?
Primarily because an individual investor's personal tax situation is incredibly complex. It depends entirely on their specific circumstances, their country of tax residence, their other income and investments, their personal status. It's simply impossible, and frankly legally perilous, for the issuer to try and provide personalized tax advice that would be accurate for every single potential investor within a general offering document. So the tax section's main purpose is really twofold. First, to inform investors about the tax status of the vehicle itself in Luxembourg, and second, to act as a clear risk warning and a strong directive for the investor to go and seek their own professional personalized tax advice before investing.
That makes perfect sense. Well, this has been an incredibly insightful journey through what can seem like a very daunting world of financial paperwork in Luxembourg. We've covered a lot of ground, from foundational EU and Lux laws through the specific requirements for UCITS, AIFs, RAIFs, and securitization deals, getting into the nitty-gritty of the process and content, and looking at the constantly evolving landscape. Hopefully for you listening, this deep dive helps you better navigate investments involving Luxembourg structures, appreciate the layers of investor protection built into the system, and understand who they primarily aim to protect, and see how regulation constantly tries to balance market access with necessary transparency. To leave you with something to think about, considering this clear push towards digitalization, like the CSSF's e-identification, and the trend of placing more direct responsibility on the management bodies of funds and vehicles, how might technology further change the very nature of investor protection and regulatory oversight in the future? Could AI review documents? Could real-time data reporting change supervision? What new challenges or maybe opportunities might that create for staying truly well-informed as an investor or a market participant? This content is generated or significantly edited using artificial intelligence tools. All information is provided for general informational purposes only and reflects knowledge available at the time of publication. It does not constitute financial, investment, or legal advice. We recommend that listeners verify the information independently and consult with qualified professionals for personalized advice. Hit subscribe and like Luxembourg Fundcast.